Before you jump into this show or watch this show, I wanted to just let you know we typically reach out to a guest and then hold a prep call. We hold a brief introductory. We talk about topics, subjects that they want to discuss on the podcast episode. When I reached out to Tom Goodwin, he declined. He said, I don't want to do a prep call. I don't think it's necessary. And in fact, he suggested we don't do an introductory before the episode. So this is the first time that he and I have actually ever met. We've worked in and around very similar circles of business, but we've never actually met each other. So what you're seeing is a candid conversation between myself and Tom Goodwin. So what I would suggest is sit back and enjoy the conversation. We cover some good topics. Welcome to Disruptor Confessions. I'm your host, John Ayers. So Tom Goodwin is probably one of the sharpest minds around advertising, around brands, around technology. My perspective on Tom is he's more about the thinking of the human experience itself. I see him as someone who asks questions that leaders, the C-suite, are either afraid to ask or they don't even know the right questions to ask. And I love that Tom brings that to the discussion. A few years ago, you talked about how Uber was probably the largest taxi company in the world that didn't own any vehicles, that Airbnb was changing how people stayed in accommodations. They didn't own any real estate. You know, just the change around Facebook being probably one of the largest media companies that didn't produce any content. The way I think you summed it up was something interesting is happening. So if you don't know Tom, he's the author of Digital Darwinism. He's the host of The Edge. He's written hundreds, if not thousands of articles. We're going to get into it. We've never met each other. Tom, we've worked in similar circles. I think you're optimistic about technology, but you're not blind to the consequences. With that, Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm always interested in how people introduce me, and I like the kind of nuance and the balance and the tone that you got there. So thanks for having me on, John.
Well, you're welcome. And Tom, one of the things that I want to ask you is, how do I introduce Tom Goodwin, right? Like, he's an ad guy, and I thought, gosh, to pigeonhole you into like this media, ad tech, martech guy didn't feel right. So let me ask you something, and maybe you've never thought about it this way, but if you're at a cocktail party or a friend's house, maybe you're on an airplane, right? Someone's next to you and they just casually say, hey, what kind of work do you do? What do you do for a living? What do you tell them? Someone who doesn't know anything about the space that you work in.
I tell them something different every time, because every time I try and explain it, I feel like I'm not doing a very good job. I'm always very vague. That's sort of part of the problem. So probably the least helpful but most accurate way I talk about myself is I think about how technology is and then is not changing the world. And I have conversations with people about it so that they can make the most of changes that are coming. But it's difficult because if you try and talk about things like a futurist, I think you lose credibility. I think a lot of futurists are quite sort of daft. If you try and pull it through the lens of kind of opportunity and innovation, I think innovation is quite a weak word. I don't think companies want to spend a fortune on innovation. It kind of seems like funky sofas in a room with neon lights. And then I try and talk about things like problem solving, but that doesn't really work either, because that's a kind of robust approach, I think, that tends to kind of ignore all these new opportunities that come our way. So as I'm doing now, I struggle to define what I do. It's a bit like kind of the Lord Chief Justice in about the 1930s talking about pornography, where they know what it is when they see it, but they can't necessarily define it ahead of time. So there are things that I do, and there are places that I go, and there are conversations I have that just sort of feel appropriate to me. But it's mostly focusing on a fairly high altitude view on what a changing world means for business. What new things can they do? What should they be scared about?
I always get a kick out of people who call them a futurist. I always thought, I want to become that. I want to be that futurist. And the more I've thought about it, and I kind of landed where you land.
What I find annoying about it is the way that you become a good futurist and the way that you become a kind of successful futurist is you have to be really outlandish. So when one person's talking about Web3, you have to talk about Web4. If someone's talking about the metaverse, you have to be talking about quantum computing. You have to have videos that are ever more dramatic with smaller and smaller robots that are in more and more places. And quite often I speak at events where there is a futurist. And I always just think it's quite weird, because if I was in the audience, I'd be thinking that was very entertaining, but not remotely helpful. I'm going to go back to the office tomorrow and I've got to fill in a business case for, why we should change toner supplier or something like that.
Right. So I was asking you, like, how do you tell someone, like, random person on a plane? And it's kind of difficult to do. I get that. But Tom, like, if an executive is thinking of hiring you and they ask you, why should we hire you, Tom? How do you respond to that?
Normally just say, well, normally it's through conversations. So they'll find me interesting. Like in some ways, it's my job to be kind of professionally interesting. It's my job to solve problems in ways which are more imaginative than other people. Increasingly, I'm working with senior leaders to help them get more out of their consultants. So it's a fairly common brief now that someone working for a pretty large company will have somewhat inherited Bain or McKinsey or Accenture, and they're kind of dreading every meeting with them, no disrespect to them. And they kind of want someone that's going to make them work harder. They want someone that's going to push them to do more than just press find and replace on the other car company's presentation they did. They want someone that sits in meetings and says, does this really matter? So I kind of play sort of professional bad cop sometimes with consultants, because I really think this is an amazing time to do what we all do. I think it's an amazing time in business. I think there's lots of opportunities everywhere. But I do think we tend to get drawn towards comfort. We get drawn towards evidence. We get drawn towards best practice. So often it's my job to kind of push people to think a bit harder and to do things a bit differently.
I really grabbed onto the word disruption for a number of reasons. People think of disruption as always being negative. I think it can be positive and negative. It can be very, very impressive to disrupt something that needs disruption. Your point of view, having lived and worked kind of in that space of consulting and transformation for many years and now bringing it back in, I think you're hitting at a really important time. I think AI is changing the way some of those companies you mentioned are doing business. You talked about futurism just a minute ago. I know you're grabbing onto the word nowism, so I want to talk about that in just a minute. You're also calling, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, you just say, why are things weird right now? You're calling it out, like you're saying things are weird. And let me frame it this way. I'm observing, Tom, you tell me, but like companies are very tactical. They're very mired in the details, the analytics, the spreadsheets. They're focusing on the what and the how. They're kind of ignoring or forgetting the why. Why are things weird? Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing?
I mean, it's quite hard to talk about this, but I think somehow we've got so paranoid about change being faster than ever. I think we went through enormous amounts of chaos with COVID and working from home. I think we're feeling lots of weird emotions, and we're feeling like somehow everything should be different, but somehow it's not. We're feeling like people in technology keep on telling us that we're going to have a VR headset on our heads, and we're going to have, we're going to buy things through our voice, and we're going to have things delivered through drones. And that's not really happening. So there's this huge sort of tension, I think, between this amazing world that we're promised and then the kind of reality of day-to-day living where you're still, delayed because the pilot sort of lost paperwork or something. I think we're living through an era of kind of algorithmic news, which I think, I'm not the first person to talk about it, and it's not really my area of focus, but I do think we're constantly surrounded with fairly unusual representations of reality. I think we're spending less and less time with each other. I think we're spending less time with moderate voices. Sometimes I wake up and I check my Instagram feed and it's full of absolute paranoia that, America's on the edge of civil war. And then I'll look at my Twitter feed and it's full of absolute assurance that none of us are going to have a job in 18 months' time. And then you kind of turn on LinkedIn and you're kind of surrounded by a very different world. And I don't think anyone ever thought that they could look at the world objectively. There was that lovely sort of quote from Alain Ney, we don't see the world how it is, we see it how we are, which I think was always true. But increasingly, we're not really seeing the world how we are. We're seeing the world how algorithms have decided we should see the world. And therefore, I think it's quite common for people to be whipped up into a frenzy. It's quite common for people to have a slight amount of, paranoia. It's quite common for people to think that the world is against them. It's quite common to feel a bit hopeless. It's quite common to feel, guilty because of climate change. So therefore, I think we're in a situation where people are just trying to get through the year. You start getting to kind of mid-November and you have these sort of Zoom calls and people look like they're kind of dying on the call. They'll sort of confide in you later on that they're just trying to kind of, get by until Christmas time or something. And then you get to this time of the year and people are already kind of struggling, kind of looking to Easter or something. I'm not sure. So there is just this slightly sort of weird energy, I think, in the world. And I think a lot of it is because a lot of us are being kind of whipped into a frenzy and a lot of us are having our kind of brain chemistry sort of manipulated a little bit. I don't mean that in a weird sort of medical way. I just mean, the average piece of stimulus that's shown in front of you is not reassuring and it's not something designed to make you feel calm.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned like some of the things that we were promised or are being promised today in real time. Like we're going to have all these amazing things. And in some respect, I think it was in the '84 Olympics where there was a guy on a jetpack who came down and we were all going to be flying with jetpacks in a few years. Here we are in 2026 and that's not happening. However, this podcast in and of itself, that we can stream clear video in real time, is quite remarkable. So there's this incredible stretch of like amazing things. We're living in the future today to things being promised that just aren't real. Would you agree with that?
No, I that's exactly right. And it kind of leads me quite nicely into the sort of nowism piece, which is whenever I talk, unless people are paying a lot of attention, they think I'm contradicting myself all the time. Because one minute I'm saying things are amazing, the next minute I'm saying things are worrying. One minute I'm saying, technology is going to change the world. The next minute I'm saying it's going to happen slowly. People really conflate the change that comes from remarkable technology and magical technology with change that happens from transformative technology that can be quite basic. So the smartphone is simply an incredible device that will wholeheartedly change many, many industries. But we're already about halfway through that revolution. Your average sort of real estate agent has just got to grips with the idea that they could take photographs of an apartment, let alone the idea that they might use WhatsApp or share their location with a pin or something. So I end up sort of sounding quite miserable all the time because I'm really aware that Bluetooth is incredible, 5G is remarkable, Wi-Fi is amazing, streamed video like this is incredible. The ability to learn anything from the internet is outrageously profound. But if you look around most of the world, it doesn't feel like that. And therefore, quite often my advice to clients, I guess, is to be curious about AI and to be experimenting with large language models, but not to forget that it's also important to have, your address on Google Maps correctly. It's quite sensible to have your opening hours correctly. Maybe you might want to get some customer service via WhatsApp. Maybe you might want to reply to emails rather than sending emails from a do not reply kind of inbox. So I think sometimes in our jobs are to kind of balance what is quite mainstream but really exciting, as well as what's very new and magical and sophisticated, but quite difficult to do something with.
Tom, people listening and watching this probably run the gamut. So there's people who work in the business, strategy, transformation space, and there's probably C-level executives trying to make sense of it for their company, for their teams. You talk about something, and I think it really is, as we sit here in Q1 of 2026 in the business world, you talk about traditional branding, traditional brand strategy, and performance and analytics. That to me feels like the intersection we're at right now, and why I think your voice is probably more important now than ever. Can you just talk about how you see those two categories of traditional, what I would call old school branding, the Mad Men on Draper, and the performance analytics?
I've got quite a lot to say on this, actually. I mean, for most of, I come from a similar background to you, John. And I mean, I think I've been working in it slightly less years, but for about 25 years, I've been in advertising and most different types of advertising. And for most of that time, the majority of money was spent sort of above the line. And that meant big campaigns. And that meant that we didn't really know if it was we didn't really know how it was working. We knew that it worked. We knew that if we spent $25 million on pedigree advertising, that we'd get more facings in supermarkets. We knew that we would defend our brand share. We knew that we'd make our money back, but we didn't really know how, and we knew it took quite a long time. And then around about sort of 8 to 6 years ago, a lot of newcomers, sort of direct-to-consumer brands, sort of digitally transacted brands, the likes of sort of Uber, Spotify, Away Luggage, Peloton, etc. They kind of started the performance first playbook. So they realized that now they could target people that showed interest. They realized that they could now track whether ads converted. They could, complete the loop. They could attribute. And then slowly over time, it's sort of been assumed that the performance playbook is the playbook that everyone should use. And it's been assumed that unless someone clicks on the ad, that it's been a waste of time. It's assumed if you reach someone and they don't immediately do something, it's been a waste of time. And increasingly, the kind of P&Gs and the Unilevers and the McDonald's and the Stellantises and the Marriotts are kind of looking at the direct-to-consumer. They're looking at the performance playbook and they're thinking, we need to do more of that because we can see what's working and how. And for me, it's a complete misunderstanding of what's appropriate for your industry. It's a complete misunderstanding of how brands actually work. I passionately believe that brands are incredibly important. I think they've never been more important. I think they will become more important again. And I think they work in ways that we can't understand. We have this kind of dialogue where a lot of people from the technology landscape are now talking about advertising and they've got no idea how it works. They think that advertising doesn't work on them at the same time as owning $250,000 worth of branded goods in their bedroom. So what's kind of needed is a much more kind of sensible and long-term view, I think, on how advertising actually works.
So I talk about it in terms of like people seem like they're trying to compress the traditional marketing funnel. You have this brand awareness, brand advertising, like brand strategy at the top, trying to bring awareness to an audience. And then you have first-party data, not to get too deep into technical weeds, but like first-party data, known, owned customer insights. What are your thoughts on that?
I was very excited about this for a while. I mean, there are a lot of things in life that I've changed my opinion on. And in about 2014, 2015, I'd read about all this technology, which allowed us to do personalized video ads. I presume that if you were a car company and you were trying to sell a convertible, you would wait for the amazing data trail that told you it was the first sunny day in spring, and you'd, hammer out some ads for the convertible. And the moment it started raining, you'd stick the ads out for the Jeep. So it was very, very exciting. I got really into it. And then after about 2 years, we'd figured out how to do it. And then we started doing it, and it didn't work very well at all. We probably did about 20 trials, and we realized that we were paying about 15% more, and we were getting an uplift of about 3 to 4% of a metric that didn't even matter. And then, over time you get a bit older and wiser, and you realize, that's not really how advertising works. Like, you're not really going to jump out and buy a car, because it's one sunny day. You're not really going to suddenly, be aware that off-road vehicles exist just because it's a bit snowier this year. You actually tend to realize that a lot of advertising is quite primitive. Like it really works through wastage. It works through production values. It works through repetition. It works through simplicity. If I think about all of the brands that I wouldn't even say I'm fond of, because I don't even need to like them. All of the ads that are top of mind, all of the things that I routinely buy, they're things that I see often, and they're things that are repetitive. I'm not buying them because I'm trying to broadcast who I am to people. I'm buying them because I don't want to mess up, and I don't want to have to explain to myself why I made a bad decision. So you end up in this place which is really disappointing, because you realize that maybe our jobs are not that difficult. Like, maybe we need to do a jingle. Maybe we need to have a tagline which runs on all the ads. Maybe we need to keep the copy the same for a year or two. Maybe we don't need to be as busy as we think we should be. Maybe we don't need an insight in the ad. Maybe just producing something that's high quality and somewhat timely and somewhat exciting is enough. Maybe we don't need to be that creative. Over time, I'm realizing that almost everything about marketing that we knew to be true in 1960 is pretty much the same today. The tools that we have and the opportunities that we have and the sort of business dynamics that we might be facing may be quite different, but a lot of the strategy, not the tactics, a lot of the strategy might be almost identical.
I actually wonder if it's more important now than ever because people are moving so damn fast. Technology's taking over. Analytics are like seemingly the most important thing, and metrics and reporting and AI. And I feel like brands should connect with an emotion. I want to ask you about transformations because it seems like you're now doing it on behalf of companies to try to get more out of the consultants they're working with. How often is transformation really happening? Like what does digital business transformation look like when it really works? And how often, Tom, is it just rearranging the chairs? Like, can you just talk about that?
Halfway through that question, I kind of thought you might be getting to that question, and I was kind of hoping you weren't going to ask me it because I always have to be honest. I have this kind of weird sort of inability to sugarcoat things. I mean, I wrote a book maybe 8 years ago all about businesses and change, and when I wrote that, I did an immense amount of research on companies that have actually changed. And when it comes to like a very significant core change, it's almost never happened. I mean, you could make an argument that Tesla changed. You could make an argument that McDonald's changed. You could make an argument that Microsoft and Netflix have changed. But 99.99% of companies have not changed at all in any meaningful way. Like they might have a new initiative, they might buy a new company, they might have a kind of wing that does innovation. But if you were to kind of go through their offices and kind of, knock on things, and if you were to sit in meetings, and if you were to look at things like culture, if you were to look into things like how business cases were evaluated, if you looked at things like people's performance reviews, the kinds of people they recruit, the kinds of things that people have made, a real significant change has almost never happened. And when I first started saying this maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I was quite critical of it. And now I realize that that's kind of how it works. I mean, if you are, luxury retailer, you do luxury retail really, really well. And when the whole world shifts quite a lot, you probably don't have it within your bones to change that much. You're so good at what you used to have to be good at, it's almost impossible not to be. It's like getting a car company to launch an EV. 99% of people within that business are not thinking about things that way. They're not thinking about the problems that development sort of takes them towards. So for a long time, I kind of wondered what to do about it. Like, to some extent, should I be happy with the superficial transformation? Should I go into workshops with Whirlpool? Should I go into meetings with American Airlines? And should I pretend that this is real transformation? And sometimes I do that. And sometimes over time, I've realized that actually the way to think about this, and it's not something I talk about that much, but I should do, is probably the solution is not to get big companies to change. It's probably to get big companies to set up new entities, whether that's a new company, whether that's a new department. But companies in a way should almost have kids. As humans, when we get old, we can either have sort of surgery and pretend to be young, or we can have sort of therapy and get over the fact that we're aging, or we can just die, or we can have kids. And actually, I've always thought the kind of business model for what would a child of Ford look like, or what would the daughter of Nordstrom's look like, or how do you take the kind of very best elements of a Procter and Gamble or of a Burger King, and sort of incubate that with the intention that it creates the future entity of that business. And I've always thought that's a really profound question, and I've never really written about it. I've never really talked about it externally, but in meetings, it's a kind of brainstorming session I quite often have.
You're touching on the very core essence of why this podcast is so important to me. And that is, I've seen it a few times, right? I've seen it in desktop publishing when MP3 file compression, it completely blew up the music industry. Netflix, you mentioned, right? They were delivering a disc in the mail, and they destroyed their own business model and went to where they're at. So you're right. I think true transformation doesn't happen often. You mentioned Ford and some of these companies, like I think Amazon's building out Zoox, this autonomous vehicle, from the ground up. It's not really a car company, I guess. So that isn't the question, Tom. Like, just take automotive, for example. Should any car companies exist as they have the last 100 years? Shouldn't we be thinking about autonomous vehicles taking over? Just give that a thought as an example. How do you see that?
There's the sort of ideal state. So again, a lot of my work is trying to get the balance between, in an ideal world, this is what would happen, and if no one has these meetings, then this is what will happen. And how do we sort of find our trajectory between those two extremes? The sort of subtext and kind of the kind of subtitle of my book, Digital Darwinism, was what would your company look like if you set it up today? And it's a very me question, because it's sort of really helpful in a way, and it's really sort of provocative in a way, but it's also incredibly annoying as well, because if you sit in meetings as Ford, or if you sit in meetings as, Stellantis or as General Motors, and someone says, what would your business look like if you set it up today? Like, yeah, you wouldn't have car plants in Canada right now. You wouldn't be importing items from Mexico, because right now that's a bad idea. You wouldn't have a massive sunk cost into ICE combustion. Maybe your dealership network wouldn't exist. But that's not a very helpful question, because you are where you are, often because of decades or hundreds of years of really good decisions that were made with all the information that people had available. And now you end up in this situation, and you're not in the perfect situation. You realize in retrospect, you should have, thought about China a bit more, and you should have been aware of what they're going to do to the industry. You should have been more excited by, technology that helps you get ADAS level 5. You should have been really excited about what software can mean for the ownership experience, but you're not. So then you have this question, which is, okay, do we try and sort of burn everything down and reinvent ourselves for the future? That's not really viable, because you're a publicly traded company and everyone's going to sell stock immediately when you say that. Are we going to sort of dig our heads in the sand and hope that nothing happens? No, that's terribly optically. But what you do is you sort of find yourself on the journey. So probably what you do is you do a lot of press releases about investing in green energy. You probably do a lot of work on your innovation unit, and you have a competition where startups will present ideas for in-car entertainment systems. You'll have a kind of AI lab, or 3 years ago a metaverse lab, and 4 years ago a Web3 lab, 7 years ago an IoT lab, and you'll sort of market the hell out of the fact that you get it. But ultimately, most of the time, that doesn't lead to anything, because companies are very bad at doing medium-sized things. They're very good at small, like a pilot project. They're amazing at doing something in the New Zealand market. Fantastic. Partnerships, wonderful. The moment that something kind of needs to go from small to medium is where companies really, really struggle, actually. And again, that's where my sort of idea of having kids has sort of always come about, because it seems like the perfect way to draw upon the expertise that you have in the current way of doing things. It's a great way to tap into your strong financials. It's a great way to signal to the market that you're not changing, but instead you're building something for the future.
That's actually a great segue. You've kind of captured this word nowism, or certainly aligned alongside it sometimes. I think you have great observation of past, the recent past. You just mentioned like IoT and the metaverse, but even like distant past, 60, 70, 100 years ago. And you're very careful of calling yourself a futurist, but like you're really hooked onto this nowism. First question, Tom, like when did you first hear the word nowism? How did you come across it? When did you first come across that?
I mean, it's nothing like as big a concept as I'd like it to be. Like I kind of hung my sort of hung my future on it to some extent, and I don't think it's really landing with people. It came about because the moment we talk about the future, we basically give ourselves permission to not do anything about it. When you sort of present the "This is the world in 2030" deck, everyone sort of claps and they find it quite interesting, and they didn't check their phone that much, but they don't go to their desk and do something about it. If you present sort of 2026 plans right now, it's going to be unbelievably pragmatic, but it's going to be based on 2025 plans, and it's going to be based on 2024 plans, because most of the world works by taking what they did last year and sort of tweaking it a bit. So nowism was a sort of attempt, is a sort of pun on futurism. We're always sort of presented with, one day we're going to have robots. One day there's going to be drones doing things. One day, we're going to have computer brain interfaces, and we're just going to think about something and it's going to arrive. And nowism was basically, let's look at all of the things that we can do at this moment in time. Let's look at what simultaneous location and mapping can do for our business. Let's look at what 5G can do for our business. If we now have Touch ID and we can use Space ID and we can use Apple Pay, how can we make it unbelievably easy to buy anything? It sounds like I'm taking the piss when I say it, but what if a company really got behind the power of email? What if you were running late to check into your hotel and you could just email the reception desk and tell them that you're checking in late and ask them if there's still going to be someone up at that time. It seems kind of extraordinary, but it's almost impossible to do that. What happens if you wanted to email American Airlines and say, I don't understand how many bags I can take on this flight. Can you tell me? We've really not sort of got excited about a lot of the technology that we have. A lot of our current reality has been a very immediate and defensive and sort of reaction to panic. Oh shit, what are we going to do about the internet? Let's have a website. Oh shit, everyone's got a phone now. What can we do? Oh, we'll optimize the mobile website. And Nowism is the act of proactively going through everything we've got now and thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if I could book a test drive with one button push? Wouldn't it be amazing if everything just worked? Wouldn't it be amazing if I could see where my parcel delivery person is like I can with my Uber? Wouldn't it be amazing if I could, book a French lesson with someone who could turn up later on that day because they've had an appointment cancel? It's just sort of looking at all the really pragmatic things we could do now with a bit of imagination and ambition.
It brings me to a conversation I want to have with you, and that is like everything is around data. And I'm troubled by that because years ago, I was asked during an interview for a report about data being the new oil, data being the new currency. And I literally said, I think it's like 2018, 2019. I said, listen, like I get it that data is like the new currency, data is the new oil. I hear that all the time, but I actually feel data is not the new oil. Trust is really the currency. And that's going back, I'm not Nostradamus, I'm not like a futurist, but like that's going back when GDPR was being launched. So Tom, here we are, 2026. I want to ask you, what is the state of trust? And I put the word truth alongside that. And I want to ask it in the context of government, in business, in brands, in each other. I ask the word trust and truth because I wonder how you see the customer. How is the customer? How are we as human beings changing in the context of trust?
There's sort of two things here. I mean, I think often when we're in the industry, we think that people care about what we do and how we do it, and they don't care. So I don't think people really care about their data that much, and they don't really care what a company's data strategy is. They just care about the experience they have. And I've always thought that as long as companies can provide value for the data that they have, then people are happy to share it. So I'm very happy for an Uber to know where I am because that's the only way I'm really going to get in the thing. I'm very happy for Google Maps to know where I am and how fast I'm moving, because that means I can get that data aggregated as Google traffic data. It means I know how long it's going to take to get somewhere. So most people are not paranoid about data. Most people are not freaked out by advertising that appears to be somewhat helpful. So that's the first thing, is people need a sort of an exchange for it. The second thing, and it's much more sort of exciting right now, is, I don't want to be dramatic, but when we were talking about the world being weird before, I think something that I didn't mention is we're facing a really, really strange time when it comes to trust. I think this is mainly a function of AI, but I think it's also a function of algorithms. My inbox now on my computer is now completely full of spam, and it's also completely full of scams. Now we have an environment where people are almost normalizing, questioning everything, whether it's fake news, whether it's sort of manipulated news, whether it's news that seems a bit untrue but is somewhat sensational, or almost every single facet, I think, of our lives today are kind of under threat when it comes to sort of digital trust. I think it's mainly a function of AI, but people's ability to personalize emails at scale, people's ability to kind of clone websites, people's ability to put printed QR codes on front of printed signs to send people to dodgy websites. I think we're in a really, really sort of powerful moment where people don't trust things. It sounds very boring, but just before we came on, I was trying to buy a water filter. And I've spent a lot of time researching water filters, which is an incredibly boring thing to do. And you realize that you have no brands to navigate through. And you realize that when you go on Reddit, you don't really trust what people are saying now, because you kind of assume it might be people hacking, either SEO or GEO. And then you ask a large language model and you don't really sort of trust the answers because you feel like they've been manipulated a bit. Then you got a Google sort of YouTube review of water filters and you realize they're probably getting money from affiliate marketing. And you suddenly realize you're kind of in a situation where you start to sort of doubt a little bit of everything. And oddly, I think it's that environment where brands are becoming more and more important. Because when a brand has advertised in a mass way, if a brand is one that you kind of recognize, if a brand sort of appears to appear in many, many places, like all of a sudden you start to trust them because you realize they wouldn't be doing that if they didn't believe in their own future.
You just hit on something else. You mentioned it earlier, and I'll put it together, this value exchange. And I call it a consent relationship. I'll give I'll give a company my name, email address, maybe my phone number. But will I give them, my credit card data? Will I give them my physical address? It depends on the value they're going to give me. And I call that a consent relationship. But I want to ask you kind of in what you were just talking about, like spam and scam and truth and trust. You were working in media where we were pushing the boundaries in leveraging data to target not an audience, not a male demographic or a female demographic, but literally we can target Tom versus John because we know exactly Tom's profile on a specific channel. What is your position in 2026? What is your position on how companies have used data for their profit? How do you see that?
I mean, I'm sounding very miserable here, but the first thing I'd say is, as an industry, about $300 million a year is spent on data suppliers, attribution software, DSPs, DMPs. And but if you look at it in its entirety, I don't think it's working at all. No one has ever really logged onto a website and looked at all the ads and felt that advertisers knew too much about them. Quite often I turn off my ad blocker because I'm keen to see what's out there. And I'll be targeted with, women's orthopedic shoes. I'll be targeted with training bras. I'll be targeted with MBAs in Santiago in advertising that's in Spanish. So it's not even like advertisers have a precise opinion of me and it's wrong. It's as if almost all of the data doesn't work at all. And I've talked to very senior people, actually. Like I'll speak to someone who works for one of the world's largest advertisers, and I'll say, again, I'm a bit drunk. I'll say it doesn't appear to work at all. Like, look at this. I'm on the New York Times website, and I'm being advertised with sort of crocheting kits or, travel insurance when I've just bought a policy. And they'll say, yeah, I mean, everything is amazing and it's all unbelievably sophisticated. But the problem is that if there's one or two, weak links in the chain, that it'll mess up things. And they seem to sort of think that's okay. I'm sort of flabbergasted as an industry that we continue to go down this route, which is to assume it's all working. So my kind of personal opinion is actually most people are kind of shocked by how terrible the online advertising experience is. And actually, rather than aiming for personalization, we would be much better off aiming for kind of relevance. And this is where I come across as being really sort of old and boring. But if you're on the Wall Street Journal and you're in the travel section, I don't know, would that be like a crazy place to do a brand campaign for Turkish Airlines? Would that be a really stupid place to advertise, I don't know, like a pet hotel? Would that be a terrible place just to show a really nice new hotel that Marriott's opened that looks a bit more exciting than you'd expect a Marriott hotel to be? And the idea is the caption is not, book Shenzhen Marriott. It's just to say, Marriott, more interesting than you thought. And And it all just provides this tiny bit of evidence that will sort of join in our heads. So I think the first thing we should do is stop this sort of false precision. The second thing is to sort of avoid irrelevance. The third thing is to kind of go for things that are sort of bigger, that we can connect with more, that feel better. And then slowly over time, when we actually have a more accurate data trail, that's when we can start to sort of pull people down the funnel. We can go from advertising for Samsung to advertising for Samsung TV to advertising for the highest end Samsung TV. And then we can do ads that say, one or two reasons to favor that TV over other ones. But I really think that we should be more realistic about what we actually believe. And when you actually ask people about advertising, if you say to people, do you like targeted advertising? They say no. If you ask people if they like personalized advertising, they say definitely no. If you ask them what they find annoying about ads, the number one answer you get every single time is irrelevant advertising. So people actually like relevance. They just don't like personalization.
Yeah, I think the one that always cracks me up is you mentioned you buy an insurance policy, or you just took a trip to Hawaii and then you get ads for a trip to Hawaii for the next 3 months. It's like, though, it's wasted media spend. It's annoying to me. It's all the things that you talk about. Hey, I want to pivot to AI real quick. You mentioned IoT, you mentioned the metaverse, you mentioned some of these things that were like the shiny new bubble object at that time. I mean, machine learning and predictive has been around, for years. Generative AI, it's now all the rage. How has your thinking changed about AI?
Again, I'm annoyingly in the middle, because the world seems to be people saying, oh my goodness, everyone's going to lose their job. Anyone can be an advertiser now. If anyone needs a business strategy, use my prompt. McKinsey are cooked, there's that. And then there's people saying, it's just a stochastic parrot. It doesn't know anything. It's dumb. It's wrong all the time. So I'm kind of firmly in the middle, which is to think it's really, really transformative. It's a very vague collection of tools. A lot of what people are celebrating today as a business result success is actually something we used to call something else. We used to have predictive analytics, and now it's AI. We used to have preemptive advertising. Now that's AI. We used to have computer graphics. Now that's AI. So a lot of the things, chatbots are now AI. A lot of the things that we're celebrating are actually things that have been around for a really long time.
If AI vanished tomorrow, like AI just completely vanished, what changes?
I think we're in the early days. I think right now I'd actually be quite relieved about it, because I'd have less spam to get through and I'd see less crap on social media, and we'd see a bit of a thinning out of the nonsense. I do think it has really, really profound effects. Small and medium-sized companies get access to better software. I think it means that small entities will get access to the ability to make better ads. I do think that, with the curious people, we'll be able to sort of play around and accomplish more. I think about what I was saying about emails before. I think companies will be able to scale customer service that feels somewhat personal and somewhat powerful more effectively. So I do see a lot of ways that it can be great. Some people seem to think that it can solve new maths, that it can create new materials, that we can test 1 billion drugs and cure cancer. There's a lot of really, really exciting things that could be possible. When I look into that, I think a lot of the claims are a little bit fanciful, but I think there's some reality to it. So I think we'll see some level of improvement in many aspects of life. But my main thing is it's just going to take a long time. We've had the internet now for 25 years, and we're probably about the way into understanding it. So I would expect that it'll take 5 to 10 years for AI to really change things. It'll be companies that are built around it. It'll be companies that sort of design their workflows and their structure and even design their company strategy around it. But I think it's going to take a long time. I think probably in about a year or two, there'll be a bit of a sort of miniature trough of despair where a lot of people are saying, I can now make a video of a cat, doing karate in a spaceship. Is this all it is? So again, I'm in the middle where it's amazing, but it's going to take a long time. If it vanished now, I think we'd all be fine. If it vanished in 3 years' time, I think we'd be screwed.
Yeah, I think I've heard you say recently about, and you touched on it, like AI is maybe raising the floor, but not the ceiling, right? I think I have that right. Is that how you see it?
I think so. I mean, again, like everyone in sort of advertising and, business transformation is very dramatic about it, but if you're working on the Nike account or the Adidas account or the Marriott account or the Samsung account, you've already got access to amazing people. You've already got access to the budgets to do incredible things. It probably isn't going to change that much. If
Right.
you're a local, gym, all of a sudden you get to make an ad that's,
Right.
40% as good as Nike's.
Right. Right. Just thinking about like the last couple of years, especially the last 2 to 3 years, what do you think the market has gotten really wrong?
Oh, that's a big question. By the market, you mean sort of advertising or business?
More in the transformation space, I guess. Digital, ad tech, martech, AI, the kind of some of the topics we're covering. What do you think things were like? The market just went down a path, and you think that was the wrong path?
Maybe I'm going on about it, or maybe I'm being consistent. But the goal of advertising and branding is not to sell more stuff now. Like the goal of advertising is so that you can charge more money. And if you're a company in a fairly typical space, you make a lot more money if you can charge 15% more and maintain sales volume than you do if you increase your sales by 50%. So I've seen lots and lots of briefs in my life that need to increase sales by 20% or 30%. You don't make that much more money. If you can build a brand and you can double your price or even increase your price by 50%, you are making a phenomenal amount of money. It also means you can then go and launch other products and services more easily. It means you can recruit people more easily. It means that you can get distribution more easily. So I think one thing that we've got wrong is there's been a total failure to understand how advertising and branding actually works and what our goal should be. I think number two, we've completely ignored innovation and new products. I don't understand this at all, but if you ever try and buy a printer, you realize there are 100 printers that are absolutely identical to each other, and they're all quite difficult to use. Apart from Brother, by the way. Brother make really good printers. They're easy. You go into a store and you ask a salesperson to explain the difference. They can't. You ask ChatGPT to explain the difference. They can't. They've all got really weird names. Do you want the HP03Z8PR/BR? Or do you want the PQRST-W905Z? We need to do a much better job of actually inventing things that are a bit better. I'd love to see a microwave that just has 2 dials. I'd love to see a TV that just has a very, 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 very thin bezel and sits closely to the wall, and the remote control is beautiful. I'd love to someone to invent a car with buttons again. So we do a terrible, terrible job of MPD, and we instead try and sell things that are not different. And I guess that leads around to my third thing, which is we don't listen to people anymore. Like, we seem completely removed from consumers. We invent things that don't need to exist. We try and sell things that don't need to exist. And at the same time, we have a lot of people with real needs out there. So I think those are just some of the things we've got wrong. I'd love to see a company really, really genuinely become customer-centric.
I read a book from Steve Portugal years ago, and he talks about interviewing the customer interview. It's like user experience interview, how to do user research. And I think I think we got way away from that. To your point, the reason why I asked about what did we get wrong the last few years, Tom, is I have, my kids are Gen Z, right? So they grew up as digital natives. They always had a cell phone in the backseat of the car. They always had the internet, like Instagram came out, like they've become digital natives. Kids that are being born now, I think they're calling them Generation Alpha or the Alpha generation. They're going to become AI natives. And I'm very curious, the Gen Z generation, my kids are they're very different than the millennials above them or Gen Xers so I'm kind of curious where you see the customer approach to product and brand and experience and engagement. Where is that going?
I would never want to predict how a generation of people growing up with this technology will behave, because I think it's really hard to know what the second order consequences of this stuff will be. But at the same time, I'm 100% confident making this prediction, which is actually like the reason why people will buy things and the emotions at play and the kind of process broadly that they will follow will probably be identical to the dynamics at play today. Okay, it'd be amazing if you sort of interviewed someone in 1940 and asked them why they chose their detergent, or if you interviewed someone in 1960 and asked them why they chose their car. I'm pretty sure if you asked those questions every single decade, we'd find that they were quite similar. I think. I don't think people bought a car because Google search recommended it. I don't think people bought a car that was ugly, but it came up on Wired as a great car to buy. People tend to sort of buy things for similar reasons. The tactics of how we might discover it might change. Like we might discover a new pair of footwear, because we saw an ad on YouTube. We might sort of be recommended a new type of skincare because of an influencer. But the mechanisms that we're talking about, the idea of an influencer, the idea of a celebrity, the idea of a brand, the idea of innovation, like these things are not that different. But it's a bit like that sort of famous quote, the more things change, the more they stay the same, where to some extent, a lot of the really core things in what we do are similar. Again, people, quite quickly sort of jump in and they go, oh, that's ridiculous, Tom. Like the internet's changed everything. Or you should see my son, he spends all his time gaming. There are very, very significant differences. But I still think when push comes to shove, most people are drawing upon the same levers that they always drew upon before.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I think it's Simon Sinek's start with the why. Like people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. I remember my mom when I was a kid, I think it was like literally in the 70s, right? She would buy, I think it was Swanson TV dinners, and she had a bad experience. She'll never buy the product again because it was an experience with a brand, right? I mean, and now Apple Computer, I grew up with kind of the Apple experience, so I'm a big fan, but I don't like where some of the leadership is going like politically. So I'm tortured by some of those kind of conflicts, but I have an experience with a brand, so I have an affinity to it. So I align with you, Tom, on whether you're Gen Z or Alpha or whatever. It's still going to be that human experience. Can we go through some Tom Goodwin rapid fire questions?
Over it.
Will agencies exist in the next 10 years? Will they shrink or consolidate? What's your take on that?
I don't like saying this, but I think they will shrink. I think, I worked at the kind of publicist level for a while, and my question was always, what are we giving people? What's the purpose of this? And I think holding companies are either in the background or they're in the foreground. So they're either kind of the accountancy department and the sort of legal department, and they basically are put forward by the brands that they are, and the holding company becomes back office, or the holding company becomes front and center. And you have to do one or the other. I think most holding companies are now becoming front and center, and they're selling themselves as integration. There's a lot of power in that, but I think the danger of AI is not that it does our jobs. The danger in AI is that people think it does. The danger with AI is that it becomes a sort of deflationary part of fee negotiations. The danger is that people who don't know anything about how an industry works can say quite cutting things about it. So I take no comfort from saying this, but I think it's going to be a really hard time for big agencies. And I think it's going to be a pretty good time for really small agencies. But I still fundamentally believe that almost every single marketing agency focused on the wrong thing. I think they should have focused on being business strategists and people who brought customers into the boardroom more than they should have focused on being people that make marketing communications.
Do you feel similarly about like more of the Bain, BCG, McKinsey consulting firms?
I think people buy them for a different reason. I'm sounding quite sort of dismissive here, but ultimately people bring those people in because they want career insurance. Most of the time, the quality of work that's got from these people is not that high, but what people really want is a declaration that they tried their best and they got the best people in, and that someone told them to do something. So they're kind of like a lightning rod more than a bringer of change. It depends a bit on how people use them. But as a result, I think people are really buying the logo in the corner of the decks. So I think probably those companies will realize that AI can actually do quite a lot of mid-level stuff. And I think they'll make a lot of money from the transition period now, where almost every single CEO and CSO is sort of looking for advice.
Yeah.
So I think medium term they'll do all right.
Well, I think about AI being really good at some things and horrible at others. And I want to
Yeah,
ask about creativity, kind of the world that I lived a lot in. My first half of my career is really the creative process and like really getting at the essence of a brand creatively. Will
yeah.
AI will AI help and increase creativity, or is it just going to commoditize creativity?
I've gone backwards and forwards on this. You know, at one point I did a sort of very cutting post saying AI is the average of the internet, and therefore it'll never be remarkable. It'll always only ever be competent. But then I sort of drew upon work I did before where, you know, AI can design an amazing chassis for a Formula One car because it doesn't care if it looks stupid and because it can come up with things that no one's thought of. And a bit like your sort of disruption sort of speech, you know, AI can challenge assumptions that we all accidentally have in our heads. So over time, I'm realizing that good people can use AI to become more creative.
Hmm.
And good people can kind of use it a bit like a kind of sparring partner to go into different fields. Now, I do tend to think that there are certain people that are so remarkable that they don't need that help. And actually, it doesn't really get any more from them. You know, like your typical advertiser creative, you know, is really phenomenal at doing what they're doing. And they kind of instinctively know how to do things. It's a
Right.
bit like a great writer, you know, like a great writer just knows unusual combinations of words. They know like a weird, you know, patter to stick to. So I think for the very, very best people, it won't help them at all. And I think they're amazing. I think for people that are quite good, I think it'll help them be a bit better. And then we end up in this sort of weird quandary, which I think a lot of AI conversations leads to, where you think, well, is that good because the people that were really creative will stand out? Or is that good because now everyone can do better work? Or is this bad because the people that were really, really good will have to compete with the people that weren't that good? And then this will be sort of deflationary for everyone.
I was looking you up because I know you over the last few years, your online presence. We've never worked together. We've swum in similar circles. We've never
Yeah.
literally been at the same company at the same time. You actually went to architecture school, and I think I saw that you said, oh, I was terrible at life drawing or something. Like you kind of have this interesting. I sense that you have an engineering brain inside of a creative body or a creative brain inside of a technical mindset. You have this interesting hybrid. And I feel like you would poke at anything, even if you weren't working in the space. It's kind of how you operate. And I kind of was wanting to wrap up this show with this question. What would a younger Tom Goodwin challenge you on today? If your younger self were to challenge you, what would you be asking yourself?
That's a very, very good question. I try and do this a little bit sort of naturally. Like quite often I think, what have I been really wrong on? I quite often think, you know, at what point am I arguing with people on the internet who are actually kind of really right? And I'm kind of digging myself into sort of a ditch. And I try and be sort of open-minded quite a lot of the time. It's a different sort of answer to a slightly different question. But I think something that I find very frustrating about myself, that I feel quite vulnerable towards, is my ability to actually sort of turn the debate into something which is somewhat helpful. Because I kind of stand for this sort of position of be more imaginative, be more ambitious, make amazing things happen, listen to the consumers. And I do a lot of keynotes, and people love my keynotes and they get very excited by my keynotes. I do workshops and they're quite easy for people to buy, but I don't do as much consulting as I'd like to. And I'm aware that when I do the consulting, you know, you're faced with reality. You know, you're faced with, you know, computers that don't work with this big screen in the meeting room. You're faced with the idea that the French office don't want to let the Italian office have their data. You're faced with the fact that the head of strategy is still really pissed off with the chief digital officer, you know, and doesn't want to collaborate with them. You're faced with business cases where you just go on an Excel spreadsheet and you just make up numbers. And you have to be okay with lying when you're presenting them, saying, oh yeah, you know, this is definitely going to give us $2.4 billion back. I realized that I'm not that good at the reality of how change really happens. And the way to deal with it well is almost the opposite to what I naturally do. So the way that I naturally do things is to go kind of extreme and say, you're doing it all wrong, like you're idiots. I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing. Look at how good this will be. Look at what, was happened in Romania in 2017. Like you can do better than this. But probably the way to actually do it is to get closer to their systems. It's to get more political. It's to kind of back the right people. It's to dial down the ambition. It's to kind of stand behind ideas I don't believe in. And I think I've struggled to actually really bring about change because a lot of really good ideas and a lot of good intentions don't come to life because of politics and because of risk aversion and because of not invented here syndrome and because of the timescales over which these things can happen. So I think maybe that's what potentially like a younger version of me would say. If you're so passionate about making the world better, then why don't you actually go through the process to make that more likely to happen?
I love that. Thank you for your authenticity, honesty, vulnerability, all of the above. It kind of speaks to who you are. I had several other questions here, but I think we covered a lot of stuff. I do want to ask you, I know a lot of people follow you on LinkedIn, so that's probably a good place to find you. Where should they go if they want to learn more about who you are, what you do, what you offer?
Yeah, I would hope that the algorithms work nicely and people can find me quite easily by typing in Tom F. Goodwin. So Tom F for Freddie Goodwin. But LinkedIn is quite a good place to see more kind of longer thoughts. For some reason, the algorithm doesn't really send my stuff to most of my followers, so you might have to click the bell. LinkedIn is a good place to kind of get, random chaotic thoughts and more sort of controversial stuff. And I think my website's like tomgoodwin.co as well as my more professional face where you can see more about how to work with me and what I do and stuff like that.
Tom, thank you so much for jumping on. Really appreciate it. Listen, for those of you who watched and listened, please follow along, join us on Substack, subscribe, follow, take a look at some of the other episodes of Disruptor Confession. Until next time, please stay curious, lean in, and enjoy the process. Thanks again, Tom.
My pleasure.